She was about to give birth, but her world was about to collapse. The doctor who just walked into the delivery room was her ex-husband, the same man who abandoned her 6 months ago when she told him she was pregnant, and as her baby's heart rate began to plummet, he looked at his boss and did something absolutely incredible. He refused to let them die. The scream was less a sound of pain than a primal rejection of reality. Tearing through the sterile silence of the delivery room, the fluorescent lights above the gurney were harsh, burning into Elise's tear-filled eyes as another contraction seized her, twisting her body into a rigid, agonizing arc. B-E-E-P, B-E-E-P, B-E-E-P. The fetal monitor accelerated, a frantic, percussive counterpoint to her ragged gasps. "Elise, breathe with me," a calm, practiced female voice urged, belonging to Nurse Linda Patterson, who gripped her hand with surprising strength. Elise tried to focus on the soft, steady pressure, tried to inhale the regulated air that smelled faintly of antiseptic and despair. 6 months since she'd been forced to rebuild a life that had collapsed under the weight of one man's fear. Now, that life was demanding to be born, tearing its way out of her body, and she was adrift in a sea of white sheets and cold steel. "We're almost ready for you to push, Elisa," another voice said. This one was low, resonant, and utterly controlled. The voice of authority, the voice of the attending physician. Elise blinked through the haze of pain, trying to make sense of the figures crowding around the foot of the bed. Her blood pressure, already dangerously high, spiked at the sound of that voice. It was deep, familiar, echoing through a distant, forgotten corner of her soul. She strained, lifting her head just enough to see the man standing closest to her, the one settling a pair of surgical gloves over large, capable hands. He was tall, dressed in surgical blue scrubs, his face obscured by a mask pulled high across the bridge of his nose, and a cap covering his hair. But the eyes. God, those eyes. They were the color of warm whiskey, intense and focused, currently fixed on the monitor screen. They were the eyes that had watched her weep 6 months ago, then walked away, choosing ambition and paralyzing fear over her and their unborn child. The world narrowed to a pinprick. The pain of the contraction faded into a dull background drone compared to the ice flooding her veins. "Morrison," Nurse Linda confirmed quietly, referring to the doctor who had just arrived to take charge. "He's ready for the crowning." Elise felt a terrifying calm descend, silencing the panic, fueling a cold, clear rage. She pushed the nurse's comforting hand away and struggled to sit up, ignoring the searing fire in her abdomen. "Get away from me." The words were a ragged whisper, thick with venom. The masked doctor paused, his hands freezing inches above the sterile drape. He finally looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes deepened, briefly betraying a flicker of regret or shock, she couldn't tell which, or care. "Elisa," Dr. Harry Morrison said, his voice dropping, tightening with professional urgency. "This is an emergency situation. I am the attending physician." She had known that this hospital, Chicago Medical Memorial Center, CMMC, was his domain. He was a rising star in perinatal surgery, but she had specifically demanded rotation assurance, paying extra for the guarantee that anyone but him would be on call. "No." Elise clenched her teeth, pressing her back against the pillows. "No. You are not touching me. You abandoned me. You are not delivering our son." Nurse Linda immediately stepped between them, her face a mask of concern. "Dr. Morrison, perhaps you should allow me to page Dr. Chen. We have a clear—" "No time, Linda." Harry cut her off sharply, his surgical demeanor instantly back in place, cold and unyielding. "The patient's vitals are erratic. The baby is showing signs of distress. I am here, and I am the most qualified professional in this wing. I need full cooperation. Now." Elise shook her head violently, tears finally breaking free, streaming down her temples. The betrayal tasted like bile in her throat, overriding the exhaustion of hours of labor. "I would rather die," she spat, the raw truth tearing free, "than let you put your hands on me or this child. Call Harrison. Call the cleaning staff. Just get Harry out of my sight. Harry did not move. He was a statue carved from surgical steel. Only his eyes betraying the deep, familiar conflict that always resided within him. He did not react to the poison in her voice, or the depth of the pain she had voiced, choosing instead to focus solely on the rapidly fluctuating green lines dancing across the monitor. Nurse Patterson, prepare the patient for immediate internal assessment, Harry instructed, his voice slicing through the thick air, bypassing Elise's desperate plea entirely. Linda hesitated, glancing anxiously between the enraged patient and the doctor who was actively violating a clear hospital policy regarding conflict of interest. Dr. Morrison, the patient explicitly requested. The patient is experiencing severe anxiety and elevated blood pressure, which is detrimental to the fetal health, Harry stated coolly, adjusting his mask. My duty, Linda, is to the patient's physical well-being and the life of the child. Anything else is secondary. I will proceed. Elise felt a terrifying, isolating helplessness. Her body was a battlefield, and the only soldier capable of fighting was the one who had abandoned his post months ago. She wanted to scream again, to thrash until they dragged him out, but the next contraction gripped her, stealing her breath and forcing her back against the pillows in a whimpering retreat. Beep. The monitor shrieked its protest. Before the tension could snap, the double doors of the delivery suite swished open with a decisive hiss. A tall, austere figure strode in, his dark suit jacket contrasting starkly with the light blue scrubs of the staff. Dr. Harrison, the director of clinical operations, stopped just inside the room, his gaze immediately taking in the white-knuckled grip on the bed rails, the rising tension, and the unmistakable, masked presence of Harry Morrison. Harrison's reputation preceded him. He was a stickler for procedure, a man whose professional devotion was absolute and emotionless. He did not raise his voice. The air around him simply dropped in temperature. Morrison, Harrison said, his tone low and laced with cold warning. I understand we have an administrative issue here. Nurse Patterson, please escort Dr. Morrison out. We will page the on-call chief. Linda started to move toward Harry, relief coloring her features, but Harry held up a gloved hand, dismissing both the nurse and the director with the same unwavering focus he'd give a complex anatomical chart. Sir, with respect, Harry said without turning away from Elise's bedside, I must decline. Patient Elisa Carter's vitals are destabilized. I suspect early onset preeclampsia, and the baby's decelerations are becoming increasingly pronounced. Paging and waiting for another physician to triage this situation would incur unacceptable risk. That is irrelevant to protocol, Doctor, Harrison insisted, taking a step forward. A known conflict of interest is an ethical breach that can compromise the integrity of the hospital and the informed consent of the patient. You are ordered to step back. Elise watched the standoff, the pain receding slightly, replaced by a consuming dread. Here was the moment. Harry could save his career, avoid the massive internal review that defying Harrison would trigger, simply by walking away. This was exactly what he had done 6 months ago. Chosen the safe, professional path over the messy, personal one. She waited for the familiar, devastating retreat, but Harry did not move. He finally turned his head just enough to meet Harrison's gaze, and the look he gave the director was entirely devoid of fear. It was sheer, ruthless determination. Dr. Harrison, Harry stated clearly, loud enough for every person in the room to hear, I am making a clinical judgment based on immediate, life-threatening factors. I have the necessary information and hands-on proximity to address this crisis now. If this patient suffers complication, or if the child is compromised, the blame will be on the administrative delay, not the physician who refused to abandon his duty. Harrison's face hardened. You understand, Morrison, that this decision, coupled with the patient's direct refusal, puts you in violation of several CMMC charters. You are risking everything you have built here. I understand perfectly, Harry replied, his voice never wavering. He pulled a syringe from the tray and turned back toward Elise. transforming completely back into the surgeon. The man who had once been her loving, terrified husband was gone. Only the focused, brilliant physician remained. Elise stared at him, unable to form another protest. A terrifying truth began to dawn amidst the chaos. She hated Harry Morrison, the man, with every fiber of her being for the cruelty of his betrayal. But Dr. Harry Morrison, the professional, was the only person she truly trusted to save her son. It was a hideous, painful conflict. If she insisted on her legal right to refuse him, she was sentencing her child to precious minutes of potential delay, while a stranger caught up on the case. If she allowed him to proceed, she was entrusting the life she treasured most to the one person who had already proven capable of destroying her life. Elisa? Harry's voice was softer now, directed only at her, cutting through the standoff with Harrison. He did not ask her for forgiveness or for permission. He spoke to her as one professional to another, acknowledging the gravity of the situation beyond their personal drama. I need to move quickly. Your baby is in distress. I am here. Let me help him. He was giving her the choice, but it was a cruel illusion of choice. Elise stared up into those intense whiskey eyes, searching for the slightest hint of the fear that had made him flee. Instead, she found only crystalline focus and professional resolve. The cold logic took over her fear. If he was willing to throw away his future, the future he had chosen over her to save their son, then perhaps, just perhaps, she could afford him this final terrible trust. Her breath hitched on a sob that was swallowed by the pain of the next tightening wave. Fine, she choked out, her throat raw with fury and surrender. But if you hurt him, Harry, if you hurt my son, I swear, I will ruin you. Harry nodded once, a brief, sharp movement of acknowledgement, accepting the threat and the implied consent. Linda, prepare for immediate internal exam. Dr. Harrison, I require an anesthesiologist, now. We have approximately 3 minutes before those decelerations become irreversible. Harrison stood motionless for a beat, his expression unreadable. Before finally nodding stiffly, the administration was silenced by the stark, immediate medical reality. Harry had won the ethical standoff, but only by placing the highest stakes his career and their relationship on the fragile life of their unborn child. The room detonated into controlled chaos. Harry's words, sharp and final, had sliced through the heavy layer of personal antagonism, replacing it with the cold, efficient energy of crisis management. Nurses who had been hesitant moments ago now moved with synchronized purpose, dragging instrument carts, adjusting monitors, and snapping new sensors onto Elise's abdomen. The agonizing contractions, which had defined her reality for hours, suddenly receded to a dull, distant throb, eclipsed by a far more terrifying internal tremor. Elise's eyes, glazed over from exhaustion and fury, tracked the digital screen above her. The green line representing the fetal heart rate was supposed to be a steady, reassuring wave of life. Instead, it looked like a terrified seismograph. 130, 120, his heart rate is still dipping significantly, Linda reported, her voice tight, echoing the rising anxiety in the room. Harry, already pulling the sterile sheet further down her body, gave a brief, sharp nod. He was not looking at Elise, not looking at Harrison. He was completely absorbed by the data stream, his large hands moving with surgical swiftness, checking the internal readouts. He's showing consistent early decelerations with prolonged recovery, Harry confirmed, his voice devoid of all personal connection, reduced purely to the diagnostic tool of a surgeon. He wasn't Harry, the frightened husband. He was Dr. Morrison, the professional machine, honed and brilliant. The high-pitched, insistent WEEEEOOOOO alarm joined the symphony of fear. The green line didn't just dip this time. It plunged with chilling speed. 70. 60. Elise gasped. A sound torn from her lungs that had nothing to do with labor pain and everything to do with the primal terror of losing her child. Profound bradycardia, Linda cried out, her composure finally cracking. Harry didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply pushed the anesthesiologist, who had just rushed in, aside with a practiced shoulder block and leaned over Elise. His masked face revealed nothing but the unwavering focus in his whiskey-colored eyes, now fixed intently on the area where the baby's heartbeat should have been strong. The deceleration is profound and sustained, Harry clipped out, his voice a tight wire. It's V-decel and it's not recovering. Cord compression or placental failure. Linda, what's the current fetal blood gas? Linda, her hands shaking, worked furiously at the small testing unit. pH is 7.1, doctor. Metabolic acidosis is setting in. We are losing time. Losing time. Elise felt the bottom drop out of her world. The words weren't abstract. They were about Alfie, her son, suffocating inside her. The hatred for Harry, the man, was fully eclipsed by a blinding, singular terror for her child's life. She suddenly understood the hideous cruelty of the situation. Her body, her strength, her willpower, none of it was sufficient. Her child was failing. And the only person capable of reversing that failure was the man she had sworn to despise. She found herself silently praying, not to God, but to the cold, professional machine that was Harry Morrison. Save him. Save our son. The word "our" slipped into her mind for the first time in months. Not as an accusation but as a desperate, terrified plea for shared responsibility. Doctor. Harrison stepped forward, momentarily forgetting protocol in the face of the imminent collapse. Morrison, administer terbutaline and reposition the patient. We try conservative measures first. Harry ignored him. He was already shouting orders to the operating staff filtering in, preparing the room for what he knew was coming. His voice was pure steel, cutting through the escalating noise. Get the O-negative ready. We need the mobile surgical lights deployed. And someone prep the abdomen, now. Harrison gripped Harry's arm. Doctor, you are overstepping. You do not have authorization for a section this quickly. The procedure requires multiple consultations and a signed consent form beyond the generic admission. Harry pulled his arm free, his movement quick and powerful. He met Harrison's eyes across the room, ignoring the furious, high-pitched beeping of the monitor, which now pulsed a horrifying 50 beats per minute. Dr. Harrison, we have passed the point of no return for standard interventions, Harry stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. The fetal reserve is exhausted. If we wait another 60 seconds for administrative paperwork or a second opinion, we are risking severe neurological damage, possibly death. I will not stand here and watch our son die because of bureaucratic delay. The word "our," delivered with such ferocious intensity, hung in the air like a detonation. It was the first time Harry had publicly claimed their child since he fled. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a declaration of war against any force, be it administrative protocol or professional caution, that threatened the baby. Elise watched Harry. The transformation was complete. He was risking everything. His reputation, his career, the safety he had prioritized above all else. He was choosing the chaos of fatherhood, the immediate, overwhelming risk, over the cold safety of professional ambition. Harrison recoiled, his face slack with shock at the blatant defiance. Morrison, if you proceed, CMMC will initiate immediate termination of your employment and a full review of your license. You understand the implications? Harry grabbed the surgical marker from the nearby tray and strode to the end of Elise's bed, his back to the director. He looked down at Elise, his eyes blazing with an almost spiritual devotion to the task. I understand perfectly, Harry replied. Not to Harrison, but to Elise. His voice was low, intimate, a promise whispered in the face of death. I won't lose him, Elisa. I will not lose our son. Then, with a speed that startled everyone, he ripped off the general consent form attached to the gurney, scribbled his own name with a decisive flourish across the physician authorization line, and handed it to Linda. Prep the patient, he commanded the room, throwing professionalism to the wind. We are going to the OR now. This is a crash C-section. The stillness that had defined the ethical standoff shattered into a violent explosion of motion. Elise felt the gurney jerk beneath her, the wheels screaming across the linoleum floor as Linda and an orderly thrust her into the brightly lit corridor. The ceiling panels blurred into streaks of fluorescent light, echoing the chaotic streak of fear and adrenaline surging through her. She tried to track Harry, but he was a commanding blur ahead of them, moving backward occasionally to issue rapid-fire directives to the expanding surgical team. His surgical scrubs were crisp, his movements precise, a stark contrast to the internal mess he had created. A crash C-section, the term itself sounded like an emergency landing, an acknowledgement of total failure in the natural process, but the sheer decisiveness of Harry's command, the way he had dismissed administrative threat and legal protocol, hammered home a terrifying realization. He believed their son was dying, and he was risking everything he valued to stop it. Termination of your employment and a full review of your license. Harrison's icy warning played on loop in her mind, a soundtrack to the rattling journey. Harry Morrison, the man who had prioritized his ascendant career at CMMC above all else, above their marriage, above her happiness, above his parental responsibility, was willingly, deliberately, throwing it all away. He had run 6 months ago because the messiness of fatherhood threatened the clean, sterile trajectory of his professional life. He had chosen the orderly path, now facing the messy reality of their son's immediate critical danger. He had chosen chaos, defiance, and self-destruction. Elise's hatred did not vanish. It curdled, transforming from pure, venomous rage into a complicated, agonizing mixture of disbelief and desperate gratitude. If he had hesitated, if he had tried the conservative maneuvers Harrison suggested, if he had waited for the paperwork, Alfie would be gone. She closed her eyes against the glare, the cold metal railing of the gurney digging into her palm. She hated the man who had abandoned her, but she desperately needed the surgeon who was willing to destroy himself for the life growing inside her. The gurney slammed to a stop with a painful jolt, signaling their arrival in the operating suite. The OR was a cavern of overwhelming technological readiness, colder than the delivery room, filled with the hum of anesthesia machines, and lit by surgical lamps that burned white-hot. Harry was already standing by the instrument tray, stripping off the gloves he had worn in the delivery room, his eyes scanning the setup with hawk-like intensity. He walked back to her side, his presence filling the tight space. An anesthesiologist was already positioning a screen between her face and her abdomen, preparing the epidural for conversion to full surgical anesthesia. "Elisa," Harry said, his voice quiet now, low enough to bypass the bustling nurses, reaching only her. He pulled down his mask slightly, exposing his jawline, tight with tension. He needed her to be conscious, rational, if only for a few more seconds. "I know what you think of me," he stated, his whiskey eyes locking onto hers, "but I promise you, I will not let anything happen to him." "You already signed the consent," Elise whispered, the lingering fury making her voice hoarse. "You already made the choice." "I made the right choice," Harry corrected her, his gaze unwavering. "You were right to refuse me. Your trust was broken, but I made a promise the moment I heard that heart rate drop. I will fix this." He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't attempting reconciliation. He was stating his professional and now, implicitly, his paternal intent. It was the only apology he seemed capable of giving. A promise of flawless execution. The anesthesiologist began her work. The familiar prick of the needle, a small, distant sensation compared to the profound terror that enveloped Elise. She watched Harry step back, pulling his mask back up, the transformation from conflicted man to flawless surgeon complete. "Time out," Harry commanded, his voice ringing with formal authority as the room went silent. Patient Elisa Carter, age 32, suspected severe fetal distress, profound bradycardia, signs of metabolic acidosis, proceeding with crash C-section due to imminent risk of fetal demise, knife to skin, now. Elise felt the immediate numbing spread of the anesthetic, but her mind remained agonizingly clear. She could no longer feel the fire of the incision, but she could feel the weight of the moment. Harry had thrown his life into the fire for their son. The rhythmic, high-pitched beeping of the monitor was the only sound that truly mattered. Its pulse frantic, irregular, hanging precariously at the edge of life. Elise lay perfectly still, the sterile blue drape separating her head from the controlled violence happening below. She focused on the cold, distant voice of Harry, issuing precise, clipped instructions, every word a tether holding her to reality. Scalpel, suction. Linda, monitor the blood pressure. She's dipping. The atmosphere in the OR was suffocatingly tense, a high-stakes, breathless environment where time was measured in heartbeats, not minutes. Elise tried to envision the scene beyond the drape. Harry's hands, those capable, betraying hands, working with impossible speed and dexterity to reach their child. A sudden, jarring pressure applied to her ribcage made her gasp. An anesthesiology assistant pushing down to help deliver the baby. She felt a profound sense of tearing, a vast emptiness suddenly appearing where life had resided moments before. Then, for a terrifying second, there was silence. The surgical instruments clattered, the monitor's beeping seemed to slow, almost expecting the inevitable. Elise's heart froze in her chest. Had they been too late? Had Harry sacrificed everything for a moment of silence? The vacuum of non-sound was worse than the frantic beeping had been. It was the sound of total, clinical defeat. Elise's breath hitched, shallow and useless against the sudden vast coldness in the operating room. She waited for Harry's voice, the clinical tremor of a surgeon realizing he had failed. Too late. You were too late, Harry. The silence broke not with a triumphant roar, but with a thin, reedy sound, a fragile protest against the cold, sterile world. It was a cry, small and desperate, the sound of life fighting for purchase. "We have him," an assisting nurse whispered, her voice thick with sudden, overwhelming relief. Then, the fragile sound escalated, gaining volume and fury, until it became a deep, satisfying wail, the sound of Alfie demanding his rightful existence. Elise's mind, which had been paralyzed by dread, began to thaw. She didn't weep, she couldn't. The deep numbness of the anesthetic and the emotional shock held her rigid, but the sound, that furious, relentless sound, washed over her, scrubbing away the accumulated fear of the last minutes, replacing it with pure, consuming gratitude. "A boy! We have a solid, healthy cry." Harry's voice cut through the emerging din, layered now with a profound, controlled relief that bordered on reverence. He was still the surgeon, issuing clipped, efficient orders, but the tension that had encased his voice for the past 10 minutes had finally snapped. "Cord is clamped. Alfie is clear. Assigned to the pediatric team. Now. Linda, secure the cord blood sample." Elise heard the metallic snip of the scissors, the sound of the last physical tie being severed. She tracked the movement of the team beyond the blue drape. She couldn't see Alfie, but she could hear his robust complaint as he was rushed to the warming station. Her son was alive. Harry did not immediately step away to attend to the closure. He tossed the stained surgical towel aside, his movements slowing as he walked the 2 steps to the head of the table. The anesthesiologist, finished with her immediate tasks, had stepped back, giving him space. He stood over Elise, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath the damp blue scrubs. For a fleeting moment, he was no longer Dr. Morrison, the brilliant surgeon, nor was he Harry, the frightened husband. He was simply a man, exhausted and awestruck, who had just witnessed a birth he almost missed. He reached up, his gloved fingers deliberately pulling the surgical mask down, past his chin. His face was streaked with sweat and exhaustion, but it was his eyes that seized her attention. The sharp, calculating intelligence that defined the surgeon was still there, but it was momentarily overlaid with something deep and raw, a mix of vulnerability, profound shock, and a painful, overwhelming love. His whiskey eyes were wet, reflecting the harsh surgical lights, reflecting the impossible miracle lying beyond the drape. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a whispered apology for the past, or a grand profession of love for the future. There was no need. In that single, shared, breathless moment, Their gaze locked across the blue barrier. The betrayal, the anger, the administrative threats, it all dissolved into the sheer, terrifying reality of the new life they had. Against all odds, created and saved together. He had chosen the child, he had chosen the risk. He had chosen the terrifying chaos of fatherhood over the safe, sterile structure of his career. Elise felt a single, hot tear finally break free, tracking a path down her temple. It wasn't a tear of pain, or even full forgiveness, but a tear of acknowledgement. Harry had kept his terrible promise. Finally, Harry broke the connection, turning toward the warming station, where Alfie's cries were beginning to settle into tiny, demanding squeaks. He walked over and gently peeled off the outer layer of his blood-spattered gloves, his movements deliberate. He leaned over the pediatric team, inspecting the swaddled bundle. Then, he did something utterly unexpected. He reached out, not with a physician's detached efficiency, but with a father's gentle tenderness, and placed two large, steady fingers against the baby's cheek. "He's perfect, Elisa," Harry whispered, his back to her, his voice choked with an emotion too profound to name. Absolutely perfect. He stayed for a beat longer, absorbing the sight and sound of his son. Before stepping back, the doctor persona immediately reformed, closing off the vulnerability. "Linda, the patient is stabilized. Begin the transfer process to recovery," he commanded, turning back to the table, ready to address the complex task of closing the incision. The miracle was over. Now, only the surgical duty remained. But Elise knew. Watching the controlled movements of the man who had just saved her son and destroyed his own future, that the emotional landscape of their lives had been irrevocably altered in the space of those 10 terrifying minutes. The relationship built on fear and resentment now had a foundation built on shared sacrifice and blood. The surgical lights and cold metal were gone, replaced by the hushed warmth of a private recovery suite. The world had shrunk again, centered now on the fragile, swaddled life resting against Elise's chest. Alfie was asleep, his tiny mouth making soft sucking noises against the thermal blanket, the scent of baby powder and new skin overwhelming the residual hospital antiseptic. The physical pain of the emergency C-section was dulled by medication, leaving behind a vast emotional ache, a canyon carved by relief, and the lingering poison of Harry's betrayal. She watched the rise and fall of her son's chest, realizing she had survived the tempest. Harry had saved them, sacrificing his professional sanctity in the process. The sacrifice was immense, undeniable, but it did not erase the agonizing 6 months of loneliness, nor the fear that had driven him away in the first place. A quiet knock preceded the opening of the door. Elise didn't need to look up to know who it was. The atmosphere shifted, becoming heavier, thicker with unspoken history. Harry entered, no longer wearing the blood-splattered blue armor of the surgeon. He was in simple dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, the uniform of the high-level administrator. But the shirt was rumpled, the sleeves were hastily rolled to the elbow, and his face was etched with an exhaustion that ran far deeper than lack of sleep. He looked like a man who had survived a war he hadn't meant to start. He walked slowly, respectfully, until he reached the foot of the bed. He didn't try to touch her or the baby. He stood, his hands clasped awkwardly in front of him, gazing at Alfie with an intensity that pulled every ragged breath from Elise's lungs. "He's stable," Harry said, his voice raw, stripped of the practiced clinical control. "Harrison is furious, as expected, but the outcome is good. The staff is backing the clinical necessity of the crash section." Elise's eyes remained fixed on Alfie's perfect, tiny profile. "You threw everything away, Harry." "It was never everything, Elisa. It was an illusion of control." He paused, scrubbing a weary hand across his jaw. "I had to do it. Not just because he needed a surgeon, but because I needed to prove, to myself, that I wasn't a disaster." She scoffed, a dry, bitter sound. "A disaster? You were a coward, Harry. You chose your safety. You let me believe your ambition was greater than your love for me? Or your son?" Harry flinched, the accusation hitting its target with surgical precision. He took a deep, shaky breath, and the clinical composure he had maintained for months crumbled entirely. It wasn't ambition, Elisa, it was fear. A paralyzing, toxic fear that I have carried since I was a child. He finally lifted his gaze, meeting her eyes. The pain she saw there was ancient, deep-seated, and terrifyingly real. I was 10 years old, he began, his voice dropping to a low, confessional monotone, forcing Elise to listen. My mother, she was in labor with my younger sister. My father was deployed. I was at the hospital, sitting in the waiting room with my aunt. Everything was loud, chaotic. I remember the sounds of the monitors, the running feet. I was scared, but excited. He swallowed hard, his eyes glazing over as he looked inward, back across decades. Then, the sounds changed. The excitement drained away. The doctors started shouting, not talking. And then, silence. Hours later, the head surgeon came out, looking white, smelling of sterile failure. He told my aunt, my sister was stillborn, and then he told us that they lost my mother on the table. Elise felt a jolt of shock, the medication suddenly failing to mask the cold dread that crept into her stomach. She knew Harry's family background was difficult, but he had never disclosed the specific trauma of his mother's death. The hospital tried to explain it was eclampsia, placental abruption, a sudden irreversible crisis. Harry continued, his voice barely a whisper. But all I heard, all I internalized, was the chaos I had prayed to end, the chaos that killed 2 people. I sat there, 10 years old, and I connected becoming a father, becoming the cause of life with absolute, catastrophic death. He moved closer to the bed, pleading with her with his eyes. I became a doctor because I desperately needed to control chaos, to master the things that killed my family. My whole career was built on the premise that if I followed the rules, if I was clean, sterile, and emotionless, I could prevent the tragedy that defined my childhood. He paused, his voice cracking with self-loathing. When you told me you were pregnant, Elisa, I didn't see a future. I saw a ticking clock. I saw the operating room. And I saw my mother dying. And I knew, with irrefutable, irrational certainty that if I stayed, if I allowed myself to become the father, I would somehow be the catalyst for tragedy again, that I would lose you, or the baby, or both. He shook his head, the memory physically painful. My fear wasn't about losing my job or my status. It was the terror that I would bring death into the world. Elise stared at him, unable to speak. The narrative of betrayal she had constructed, the selfish, career-driven abandonment, crumbled into dust. She didn't see a cruel man, but a terrified boy hiding inside a brilliant surgeon. A man whose entire life had been a desperate clinical attempt to outrun an inherited curse. So you ran, she finally whispered, the anger strangely muted by a wash of horrible pity. You chose to hurt me profoundly, rather than face your 10-year-old self. Yes, Harry confessed, his voice thick. I chose the controlled environment of CMMC over the messy, chaotic love of a family. I left you because I was convinced it was the only way to save you both from me. He looked down at Alfie, and a tear, heavy with years of guilt, finally slipped past his rigid control and tracked down his cheek. When the monitor crashed today, when I saw the heart rate drop, it was the chaos I feared most, manifesting exactly as I always predicted. But in that moment, he looked back at Elise, his eyes luminous with fresh understanding. I realized the fear was the real killer, not fatherhood, not me. The fear made me abandon you. And abandoning you was the true tragedy. Elise felt the sting of her own tears. The profound cruelty of his actions was unchanged. He had still hurt her beyond measure. But the reason for that cruelty had shifted the emotional landscape of her forgiveness entirely. It wasn't malice. It was mania. A crippling trauma that had twisted his moral compass. She still couldn't forgive the pain. But she could, agonizingly, understand the fear. You saved him, Elise said, her voice quiet, a statement of undeniable fact. You faced the chaos, Harry, and you won. You saved our son. Harry stepped fully to the bedside, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion, but his eyes blazing with a nascent, unfamiliar hope. I won this battle, he agreed. But I can't hide anymore, Elisa. I won't. I risked everything to save him. And that act, finally, broke the paralysis. I can't go back to the man who left you. I can't be that man again. He hesitated, then slowly extended a hand, gently laying his fingers on the curve of Alfie's tiny head. Careful not to wake him. I know the damage is permanent, Harry whispered, looking not at her, but at the child who was the physical manifestation of their shared pain and shared salvation. I know a confession won't fix it, but I need you to know that the fear was real. And now, the commitment to be his father is even more real. Elise watched him, the raw truth of his confession hanging heavy and poisonous in the sterile air. She finally understood the monster that had driven him away, but understanding did not equate to healing the wounds that man had inflicted. I believe you, Harry, she said. Her voice thin but steady. She still did not look at him, keeping her focus locked on the rhythmic rise and fall of Alfie's chest. The fear was real, but the loneliness was real too, and the fact remains that you chose to manage your pain by inflicting mine. He lowered his hand from Alfie's head, pulling back entirely. The act was one of respect, not retreat. You're right, he conceded quietly. A confession is just words. I cannot fix the past 6 months, and I will never ask you to forget them, but I can ensure that Alfie's future, and yours, is built on a foundation stronger than my fear. He straightened, and the familiar professional clarity the doctor, Morrison she had both loved and resented, returned to his eyes. But this time, it was anchored by a new, solemn gravity. Elisa, I put everything on the line today. Harrison is already drafting my termination papers. But before he completes the paperwork, I put another mechanism in motion. Elise frowned slightly, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. What are you talking about? The administrative meeting this morning was about budget allocation. Not just my job performance, Harry explained, his voice taking on the rapid cadence of a man executing a high-stakes deal. CMMC has received a substantial grant for community health outreach, specifically targeting perinatal care for high-risk and vulnerable mothers. I pushed for the immediate approval of the perinatal support program. She knew of the grant. She had worked on similar models during her time with the NGO overseas. It was exactly the type of holistic care she believed in, focusing on mental health, prenatal education, and postpartum integration, addressing the whole spectrum of chaos surrounding childbirth. It's an excellent program idea, Elise admitted warily. But what does this have to do with us? Or your job? I used my leverage, Elisa, Harry stated plainly. I resigned this afternoon, effective immediately, before Harrison could fire me. But I secured one major concession: the final funding allocation and the immediate establishment of the perinatal support program. He took one deliberate step closer, placing a sealed envelope on the bedside table. The board has approved the structure, the budget, and the director of operations. I leveraged every political favor, every professional contact, and every single shred of influence I have left at CMMC to secure the appointment for you, Elisa. Elise stared at the envelope, her heart beginning to pound. Not from anger, but from a sudden, dizzying sense of possibility. Director of the Perinatal Support Program. She read the title silently, realizing the magnitude of the role. It was a 6-figure position, providing stability, healthcare benefits, and most importantly, the professional respect and autonomy she had sacrificed to be with him years ago. It's not guilt money, Elisa. Harry preempted her accusation, reading the suspicion in her eyes. It's restitution. You are the most qualified person for this role. Your experience with multicultural NGO work, your strategic planning skills, and your undeniable passion for this population, it's all there in the proposal I submitted in your name. I simply used my influence to make sure the board couldn't dismiss the candidate because she was a woman I hurt. He paused, letting the weight of the sacrifice settle. He had given up his entire career safety net, the one thing he truly valued, and channeled the wreckage into an opportunity for her professional resurrection. "This is not an attempt to buy my way back into your life," Harry stressed, his eyes intense. "This is an acknowledgement that you should never have had to sacrifice your career for my fears. This program gives you autonomy, a massive platform, and the security Alfie deserves. You will report directly to the clinical director, Dr. Harrison. I will have zero professional contact with you." Elise picked up the envelope, her fingers tracing the embossed CMMC logo. It was a lifeline thrown across a vast chasm of pain. She had spent 6 months fighting for financial survival, fighting the creeping feeling that she had lost her professional identity entirely. This job was the antidote. It was more than just a job. It was Harry facing the chaos he feared, not by running, but by creating structure for her, outside of him. It was an act of profound respect for her competence, not pity for her suffering. "Harrison will be furious," Elise noted, a small, cold spark of satisfaction igniting in her chest. "He is incandescent," Harry confirmed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He believes this entire situation is unethical, but the board signed off on the funding and the appointment before he could stop it. They see the undeniable quality of the program proposal and your qualifications. You are the director, Elisa. Your authority is absolute within that program structure." She looked down at Alfie, then back at the man who stood before her, humbled, ruined professionally, but finally, wholly present. She still hadn't forgiven him, and she knew it would take years, if ever, to mend the intimate wounds. But she recognized the gift. It wasn't love, not yet, and perhaps never again the passionate, reckless love they once shared. This was a partnership born of trauma and obligation, built on professional respect and a shared purpose, securing the future of their son. She would take the job, not for Harry, but for Elise Carter, the woman who deserved to stand on her own 2 feet again. "I accept," she said, the words firm and decisive, reclaiming the power he had once stolen. "I will run that program, Harry. And I will run it better than anyone CMMC has ever seen." Harry let out a slow, silent exhale, the tension draining from his frame. "I know you will." He remained standing there, watching her hold their son, his professional duty fulfilled. The awkward silence returned, heavy with the weight of the unwritten future. "I need to go, now," Harry finally murmured. "I have a lot of administrative mess to clean up. And Harrison won't make it easy." Elise nodded, watching him turn toward the door. She knew this was the moment their paths diverged professionally, ensuring the clean separation Harry had promised. He reached the door, his hand on the cool metal of the handle. He paused, turning back one last time. He wasn't looking at the envelope, or the bed, or the ruins of his career. He was looking only at Alfie. "I'll call Linda to arrange a time to visit tomorrow," he said softly, establishing the new boundary co-parenting. "Strictly scheduled." "Do that," Elise agreed. Harry nodded, his expression one of agonizing regret mixed with firm resolve. He stepped out, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. Elise was left alone with Alfie and the envelope. She had professional security, financial stability, and a terrifyingly blank canvas for the future. The betrayal had left a scar, but the opportunity, purchased by Harry's professional self-destruction, had given her the sharp, necessary tools to start healing herself. She was no longer defined by his abandonment, but by her own capacity for leadership and survival. She shifted Alfie slightly, pulling him closer, then opened the envelope and began reading the detailed mission statement, already formulating her plan for the program's launch. The path to forgiveness was long, but the path to independence had just begun. 6 months later, the embossed CMMC logo on the office door felt less like a trophy claimed from the wreckage and more like a simple, undeniable fact. Elise Carter, director of the Perinatal Support Program, walked into the glass-walled conference room 10 minutes before the scheduled quarterly review. Her briefcase perfectly organized, her posture radiating the cool confidence that had become her professional signature. The program was thriving. It wasn't just surviving the administrative backlash Harry's exit had caused. It was setting new benchmarks for integrated patient care, validating every political maneuver he had made on her behalf. Dr. Harrison was already seated at the head of the table, his impeccably tailored suit and perpetually stern expression a physical barrier to warmth. He still regarded Elise with the wary skepticism of a man who believed she was a walking ethical violation, but he could no longer deny her results. Director Carter, Harrison began without preamble, adjusting his tie. The numbers are acceptable. We've seen a 30% reduction in postpartum readmissions among high-risk patients. You've earned the program's full resource allocation for the next fiscal year. It was the closest Harrison had ever come to an admission of success. Thank you, Dr. Harrison, Elise replied smoothly, opening her laptop. However, the purpose of this meeting is to address the recent complication with the Jimenez case. The quantitative data is meaningless if we ignore the human element. The Jimenez case was a flashpoint. A 20-year-old mother suffering severe postpartum depression, refusing to bring her newborn in for necessary vaccinations, citing cultural mistrust of the system. Harrison had wanted to mandate legal intervention. Elise had argued for strategic empathy. Harrison sighed, a low, impatient sound. The woman is non-compliant, Carter. We cannot compromise public health standards for emotional placation. We compromise nothing, Elise countered, her voice low but firm. Yesterday my team, using our community outreach structure, didn't send a CMMC nurse. We sent Maria Chavez, a trusted maternal health worker from the same neighborhood, bringing her own child along. They talked for 3 hours. This morning Miss Jimenez brought her baby in, full compliance, zero legal friction. She paused, looking directly at the clinical director. My program understands that trust is the currency of healthcare, especially for vulnerable populations. It costs less, and it works better. If we had moved to mandate, we would have lost her entirely, pushing her deeper into isolation. Harrison stared at the data projected on the screen, a seamless, professional graph that showed improved outcome without the administrative headache of a court order. He nodded. Once, stiffly. He hadn't changed his personality, but Elise had successfully changed his metrics for success. Very well, Director, he conceded, the title now laced with respect rather than suspicion. Proceed with the current methodology. The board is impressed with the efficiency. When the meeting concluded, Elise allowed herself a small, internal sigh of satisfaction. She was no longer running from ruin. She was building an empire of competence. She had her identity back, her purpose restored, and an office overlooking the Chicago skyline that symbolized her complete, professional resurrection. The professional success was the scaffolding for her personal healing. The distance she and Harry maintained was absolute, enforced by the boundaries they had both tacitly agreed upon. Strictly structured co-parenting visits, limited to Alfie, every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and every Saturday morning, Harry would arrive at the small, upscale apartment Elise had rented near the hospital. He would never enter uninvited. He would stand on the threshold, patient and respectful, waiting for Elise to bring Alfie to the door. He looked perpetually tired. She knew the administration at his new, much smaller clinic demanded long, grueling hours, but he always appeared freshly groomed and impeccably prepared for his son. He brought approved developmental toys, discussed Alfie's feeding schedule with Linda, who had become Alfie's daytime caregiver and Elise's confidant. There was no lingering romantic tension, no emotional pleas, no attempts to use Alfie as a Trojan horse back into her life. Harry behaved exactly as he had promised. A dedicated father ensuring the stability of his child, while completely respecting the autonomy of the mother he had betrayed. This consistency, ironically, was more healing than any sudden, grand gesture could have been. The man who ran from chaos had finally embraced commitment. One Thursday evening, Elise watched him through the security peephole before opening the door. Harry was standing patiently, adjusting the strap of a new ergonomic baby carrier. He looked up, his whiskey eyes immediately lighting up as he saw Alfie in her arms. "He's looking bigger already," Harry observed, his voice soft, a tone he reserved only for their son. "He started rolling over this morning," Elise reported, keeping the tone strictly informative. "Watch his head, he's trying to lift it too quickly." Harry nodded, absorbing the clinical advice with the gravity of a physician. He took Alfie gently, securely tucking the baby against his chest. Alfie, who now recognized the comforting warmth and deep baritone of his father, immediately settled. Elise watched them walk away, Harry's tall figure moving carefully down the hall toward the elevator. The moment he was gone, a profound sense of quiet descended upon the apartment. 6 months ago, the silence would have been suffocating, a reminder of her isolation. Now, it was restorative. She had a successful career to return to, a team that respected her, and a financial security she had built with her own hands. She sat down on the sofa, feeling the unfamiliar lightness of her freedom. She was no longer fueled by hatred or the desperate need to prove Harry wrong. She was fueled by her own success. She no longer needed Harry Morrison. That realization was seismic. She hadn't been waiting for him to come back and fix her life. She had been fixing it herself, brick by brick, using the opportunity he provided. His betrayal had stripped her bare, but his professional restitution had given her the materials to rebuild. And because she no longer needed him, the fear, the bitter, protective shield that separated her from him began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious, analytical respect. She realized what the past 6 months had truly achieved. Harry had proven that his trauma, while deep, no longer dictated his choices. His actions, consistently showing up for Alfie despite the professional fallout, despite the logistical inconvenience, demonstrated a permanent commitment to face the messiness of life. He was still Dr. Morrison, the brilliant surgeon who managed chaos. But now, he was also Harry, the devoted father who chose risk over retreat. The man who had earned her professional respect was not the same man who had earned her venomous hatred. The two existed simultaneously, forcing her to confront the complexity of human change. She looked at the empty space on the floor where Alfie's activity mat usually lay. The apartment felt vast, calm, and entirely her own. She was independent, whole, and content in her purpose. Elise knew the standoff couldn't last forever. The professional bridge Harry had built for her was complete, and she was standing firm on the other side. Now, the next move had to be hers, one that acknowledged the change in him, while prioritizing the mutual benefit of their son. The time for calculated fury was over. The time for deliberate, purposeful reconstruction had arrived. Elise stood up, walking toward the large window overlooking the city lights. She pulled out her phone, looking at the contact listed simply as Harry M. The conversation wouldn't be about forgiveness, or even about love. It would be about forming a new contract, one built on the respect, professionalism, and commitment he had slowly, painfully earned. She would invite him back into her life, not out of desperation, but out of deliberate, clear-eyed choice. She pulled out her phone, looking at the contact listed simply as Harry M. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She wasn't seeking his forgiveness, or even his reassurance. She was performing a calculated risk assessment, extending a controlled olive branch based on logic, not residual emotion. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice brisk and professional, the sound of a surgeon accustomed to work calls. "Morrison, it's Elise." There was a noticeable micro-pause, a slight hesitation that betrayed his strict professional guard. "Elisa, Alfie is scheduled for Saturday morning. Is everything all right?" "Physically, yes. He's fine. I'm calling about the schedule," she stated, keeping her tone crisp and focused on logistics. The abrupt transfers at the park, the quick handovers, they're disrupting his routine. He gets agitated when he's rushed from one environment to the next. She paused, letting the clinical necessity of the adjustment sink in. "I propose a temporary change to the Saturday routine. Instead of the park handover, I'd like you to come here. Have dinner. Spend a few hours with him in a settled, familiar environment. Silence stretched taut across the line, heavy with implications that went far beyond developmental schedules. He was processing the invitation, an unscheduled visit, inside her home, sharing a domestic space. Elisa, I understand your concern for his routine, Harry finally replied, his voice measured, but I don't want you to feel obligated. If this is uncomfortable, it's not about my comfort, Harry. It's about Alfie's stability, Elise countered, hardening her voice slightly. You have earned the right to be his consistent presence. But that consistency needs to be integrated, not executed like a surgical procedure. You see the merit in that, or you don't. She had used his own professional language against him. She heard his sharp intake of breath. I do. I accept the adjustment. Saturday at 6? 6. Elise confirmed, relief a cold, hard knot in her stomach. I'll order takeout. No need for pretense. No, Harry said, his voice surprisingly firm. Let me handle the food, you focus on Alfie. The line clicked dead. Elise stared at the phone, wondering if she had just made the single riskiest decision of the last 6 months. 6 days later, the apartment smelled richly of roasted rosemary and garlic, overlaid with the clean scent of laundry detergent. Elise had done her best to create an atmosphere that was warm and domestic, a stark contrast to the sterile, frightening environments that had defined the beginning of their new reality. Alfie was settled in his high chair, wearing a clean, white sleeper, batting playfully at a hanging mobile. Elise had dressed simply in dark jeans and a comfortable sweater. She refused to feel vulnerable. Precisely at 6, the chime rang. Elise walked to the door and opened it. Harry stood there, holding 2 thermal delivery bags, one large, one small, and a 6-pack of craft beer. He was wearing dark slacks and a gray cashmere sweater that softened the harsh angles of his frame. He looked less like the brilliant, beleaguered surgeon, and more like a normal, exhausted man coming home. Delivery, he murmured, offering a ghost of a smile. I brought Mediterranean. It's easy on the stomach. Thank you, Elise replied, stepping aside. Harry entered the foyer, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate and profound. This was the first time in their relationship, past or present, that he had entered the space with such quiet, focused respect. There was no territorial claim, no assumed intimacy, just the awareness of being a careful guest. He laid the bags on the counter and his eyes immediately sought out Alfie, whose soft cooing sounds drifted from the dining area. Harry shed his coat, and in the movement, he transformed. The professional tension that usually held his shoulders rigid evaporated, replaced by the easy, anticipatory posture of a father. He's awake, Harry noted unnecessarily, walking toward the high chair. Alfie, sensing the new presence, shifted his attention. When he saw Harry, his arms shot up, his tiny face breaking into a wide, toothless grin that instantly melted the last vestiges of distance. Hey, pal, Harry whispered, his voice catching slightly, moving to stand beside the chair. He didn't immediately scoop the baby up, but instead bent low, allowing Alfie to bat at his sweater. You're getting so big. Elise watched from the kitchen as she plated the food. This was the focus of the evening. Not the forced proximity, but the genuine, unmonitored interaction between father and son. She brought the plates to the small table. Harry pulled out a chair, allowing her to sit before he did. It was a small, almost forgotten gesture of politeness from their dating years, resurfacing unexpectedly. They ate silently for a few minutes, the only background noise the rhythmic clatter of cutlery and Alfie's soft commentary. The food was excellent: lamb skewers, hummus, and warm pita. Harry ate with the focused intensity of a man who rarely stopped for a proper meal. How's the program running? Harry asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. It was the first time they had discussed her work outside of a crisis or scheduled reporting. Exceeding expectations, Elise replied coolly. Dr. Harrison is, predictably, trying to find loopholes in the budget, but the metrics are solid. He can't touch it. Harry smiled. a genuine, warm expansion of his features that softened the perpetual exhaustion. Good. I knew he wouldn't make it easy, but I also knew you would anchor it. It's mine, Harry. I built it. Elise clarified, making sure the ownership was absolute. I know, he said simply, meeting her gaze without challenge. And that's exactly why it works. There was no need for further professional conversation. The professional bridge had been established and crossed. After dinner, Alfie started fussing, his usual signal that he was ready for his evening bath and routine. Linda usually handles the bath on Thursdays, Elise said, collecting the plates. But you're here. Would you like to? Harry didn't wait for her to finish. Yes, please. He carried Alfie to the bathroom, and Elise followed, leaning against the door frame, content to be the observer. Harry prepared the water with a precision that was clinical yet gentle, checking the temperature 3 times before placing Alfie in the small plastic tub. Alfie loved the water, kicking his tiny feet and splashing gleefully. Harry was focused entirely on the child, his large hands supporting the slick, squirming body with an absolute tenderness that was breathtaking. He started talking, not in professional terms, but in the low, nonsensical murmurs of a parent delighting in his child. Look at those strong legs, little man. Harry chuckled, carefully lathering Alfie's hair with a tiny amount of baby wash. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? Just like your mother. Elise felt a painful clenching in her chest. Just like your mother. It was the first time in 6 months he had linked her and Alfie together in a sentence that wasn't about conflict or crisis. It was a quiet acknowledgement of their shared origin. As Harry towel-dried Alfie, methodical, yet careful to avoid irritation, Elise saw the stark difference between the man who had fled and the man standing here. 6 months ago, the chaos of a simple bath, the uncertainty of a slippery child, would have triggered the fear that made him retreat. Now, he was navigating the messiness, the spontaneity, the vulnerability, with quiet competence. This was not the practiced performance of a surgeon addressing a crisis. This was the authentic, deeply rooted commitment of a man who had faced his trauma and chosen responsibility. She saw his entire self-perception reflected in the way he held Alfie securely, confidently, without the paralyzing dread that he would somehow fail or destroy the moment. He was no longer trying to control death, he was simply embracing life. He's ready for the story, Elise murmured, finally stepping into the room. Harry nodded. Together, they moved into Alfie's small nursery. Elise sat on the edge of the rocker, and Harry settled into the larger, upholstered chair, holding Alfie close against his chest. Harry chose a thick, brightly illustrated book about a little bear learning to fish. He didn't read with the booming theatrical voice of some fathers. His voice was a deep, steady rumble, soft and comforting. Alfie rested his head securely against his father's collarbone, listening intently, his tiny fingers curled into the fabric of Harry's sweater. Elise watched the perfect tableau of father and son, observing the way Harry's chin occasionally rested on the top of Alfie's head, absorbing the soft, milky scent of his child. This was the foundation they had to work with. Not the grand, reckless love that had failed them, but this quiet, purposeful commitment. When the story was finished, Harry rocked Alfie for a few extra minutes, waiting for the heavy, deep sleep to set in. He stood up slowly, carefully, walking to the crib. He gently placed Alfie down, tucking the blanket around him with meticulous care. He turned back to Elise, his eyes luminous in the dim light of the nursery nightlight. He hadn't asked her anything, hadn't pleaded for anything. He had simply been present. He's asleep, Harry whispered. They walked out into the living room. The domestic intimacy of the evening hung in the air, a palpable thread between them. Thank you for coming, Harry, Elise said, standing near the door, setting the boundary for his departure. Thank you for the invitation, Elisa, he replied, pulling on his coat. It was better than the park. He paused, looking not at her, but at the empty space on the dining table where they had shared the meal. The transitions are better for him, I agree. And it was good to see you thriving. The acknowledgement felt different this time, stripped of irony or obligation. It was genuine admiration for her strength. I'll walk you out, Elise offered. They reached the door. Harry turned, his expression now serious, reverting slightly to the man of analytical thought. Elisa, I know tonight was about Alfie, but I want to acknowledge that what you are building here, professionally and personally, is remarkable. I was a fool to ever think I knew what safety was. He looked directly into her eyes, and she finally saw not the residue of trauma, but the promise of a future commitment, rooted in purpose. He was ready. I need to go, Harry concluded, stepping into the corridor. Harry, she spoke his name, and he stopped, turning back to face her in the soft hallway light. Elise didn't move. She didn't touch him. She maintained the respectful distance she had fought so hard to establish. Next Saturday, she said, her voice low and clear, making the first proactive personal choice. Same time. You can bring the Mediterranean food again. We need to talk, Harry, about the future. Not just Alfie's schedule, but all of it. Harry's whiskey eyes widened slightly. He understood the gravity of the implied conversation, a move beyond co-parenting logistics, a move toward defining a complex life together. He nodded, a slow, solemn acknowledgement of the invitation she had just extended, an invitation not for forgiveness, but for reconstruction. I'll be here, Elisa. He walked away, leaving the scent of rosemary and his quiet, enduring promise hanging in the air. The next Saturday, the air in Elise's apartment was thicker, heavier than the week before. Last time had been a tentative exploration of function. This was the formal negotiation of terms. Elise had prepared the apartment as she would a presentation room, clean, organized, and devoid of distracting sentimentality. Alfie was asleep in the crib, and the silence was absolute. Harry arrived precisely at 6. Once again carrying the familiar thermal bags. But this time, he looked less exhausted, and more acutely aware of the gravity of the meeting. He declined the beer, opting instead for a glass of water. They sat at the small dining table, the half-eaten Mediterranean meal serving as a symbolic centerpiece nourishment taken. Now time for the hard work. Elise initiated the discussion, her voice cool and measured, echoing the professional cadence she reserved for difficult board meetings. Harry, she began, meeting his intense gaze across the table, we are not here to discuss reconciliation based on residual emotion. The love we once shared was reckless, built on unsustainable premises, and it failed us spectacularly when faced with real pressure. We are here to perform a calculated risk assessment on a new partnership, one based on the immediate, tangible needs of our son and the professional reality we now inhabit. Harry nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He offered no defense, only attentive respect. I understand, Elisa. State your terms. First, the past, she continued. I have accepted the truth of your trauma. The boy who feared he would bring death into the world, I understand him. I accept that fear drove your betrayal. But understanding does not equate to erasing the pain you inflicted. The loneliness, the financial distress, the loss of my professional identity, those were real. They will always be real, Harry. We proceed with the knowledge that you chose to manage your pain by inflicting mine. Elise paused, allowing the gravity of her statement to settle. He winced, a brief, sharp movement of his eyes, but held her gaze. I do not ask you to forget it, Elisa, Harry whispered, his voice thick with humility. It is the necessary cost of my self-discovery. I accept the burden of that choice. Good, Elise affirmed. Because the second term is built entirely on your actions over the last 6 months. You didn't just save Alfie's life. You stabilized mine. You provided me with the autonomy and platform I needed to succeed, thereby ensuring Alfie's stability. Your professional self-destruction created my professional resurrection. That action, that permanent public commitment to prioritize my independence and Alfie's security, is the only form of apology I recognize. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. Your consistency, Harry, has proven that the man who fled is superseded by the man who stayed. You have earned my professional respect and the right to be a consistent, loving co-parent to Alfie. Elisa, I am not trying to buy my way back, Harry insisted, though the relief shining in his eyes was palpable. I simply wanted you to have the life you deserved. And you have succeeded, Elise acknowledged. Which brings us to the third term. The future. I am no longer defined by my need for you, and you are no longer defined by your fear of me. We are two capable, independent professionals who share an undeniable, profound purpose. She took a slow breath. I want to build a family with you, Harry. Not based on the reckless love we had, but based on the respectful, purposeful partnership we have forged in crisis. I want to shift the relationship from strictly co-parenting logistics to co-creating a life structure. A life that embraces the chaos, rather than running from it. Elise's heart hammered against her ribs, but her external demeanor remained unwavering. She was proposing a merger, not a romance. This means integrating our lives, allowing a measure of intimacy back into the domestic space, and moving forward as a united front for Alfie. She articulated clearly, it means continuing to respect my professional autonomy at CMMC, and recognizing that my authority in this house is absolute. And it means we approach conflict not with emotional abandonment, but with the ruthless honesty of colleagues committed to the same outcome. Harry stared at her, absorbing every word, his intellectual mind grappling with the profoundly personal contract she was presenting. It was a proposal that demanded more honesty and commitment than any marriage vow based purely on feeling. You're asking me to become your partner in purpose, Elisa, Harry finally responded, his voice hushed with reverence. To redefine family as a functional shared objective. Yes, a stable unit built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice, she confirmed. Can you accept those terms, Harry? Can you guarantee that if the inevitable chaos of life descends again, you will choose to fight alongside us, rather than fleeing into the cold safety of your isolation? Harry's chair scraped back slightly as he stood up, walking around the small table until he stood beside her. He didn't touch her, but the sheer presence of his unwavering commitment enveloped her. He looked down at the dining table, at the remnants of their quiet meal, and then up toward the hall leading to Alfie's room. I spent my entire life building walls to keep chaos out, Harry said, his voice deep and resolute. I lost everything I truly valued in the process. When I saw Alfie's heart rate crash that day, I realized the only control I needed was the willingness to choose commitment over self-preservation. He looked back at Elise, his eyes clear, the fear finally subdued by acceptance. I accept your terms, Elisa. I will honor your autonomy. I will respect the pain I caused, and I will stand beside you, building this purpose. I promise you, I will never abandon this structure again. Elise finally allowed a small, deep shudder of relief to pass through her. She rose from her seat, facing him. It wasn't the passionate embrace of renewed love, but the firm, mutual acknowledgement of two people entering a high-stakes covenant. Then we begin again, Harry, she said simply. Just as the difficult discussion reached its resolution, a small, insistent sound drifted from the nursery, Alfie's waking fuss. The timing was perfect. The living manifestation of their shared objective demanding their attention. Elise walked to the nursery door and opened it. Harry followed, stopping just behind her. Alfie was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. Elise walked to the crib, easily lifting the 6-month-old bundle into her arms. He settled against her, warm and substantial. Elise turned, moving back toward the window overlooking the city lights. Harry immediately came to stand beside her, his natural protective stance returning, no longer driven by panic, but by purposeful intent. She carefully shifted Alfie, positioning the boy so that he rested snugly against both of them. Harry instantly adjusted his stance, his strong arm naturally looping around Elise's shoulders to support the baby's weight, his fingers resting lightly against her sleeve. Alfie blinked, looking up into the soft nightlight, then gazed at the large, shadowy figure of his father, and the familiar, comforting warmth of his mother. He cooed softly, a sound of perfect, undisturbed security. Elise looked past Alfie, up at Harry, They were standing side by side, united by the tiny weight between them. The professional and the personal had finally merged, forming a single, stable entity. "Look, Harry," Elise whispered, a genuine, unguarded tenderness entering her voice. "This is the safe foundation. Built on sacrifice, respect, and purpose. It can withstand anything." Harry leaned down, resting his chin momentarily against her temple, the gesture one of quiet, profound ownership. "It can," he agreed, his breath warm against her skin, laced with the scent of Mediterranean herbs and enduring promise. "We will define our future by the life we save, Elisa. Starting,